In a world that never stops speaking, silence has become one of the rarest luxuries. Open your phone and within seconds you're drowning in voices, opinions, headlines, arguments, updates, noise layered upon more noise. It never ends. We scroll not to learn but to escape. We talk not to connect but to fill the empty space between our discomfort and our distraction. But here's something most people don't realize. Silence isn't the absence of something, it's the presence of everything that matters. The Buddha once said, "Better than 1,000 hollow words is one word that brings peace." And sometimes the word that brings the most peace is no word at all. Let's pause for a moment. How often do we allow ourselves to simply be, not performing, not reacting, not explaining, just being? There's a quiet place inside you, a space untouched by chaos, free from judgment, immune to praise or blame. That's the space silence leads you to. And the reason many people fear silence is because in silence there's nowhere left to hide from themselves. We've been conditioned to believe silence is awkward, unproductive, even threatening, when in truth silence is the gateway to self-awareness, emotional clarity, and inner power. Look around. Nature never hurries, and yet everything is accomplished. The mountain doesn't speak, but its presence humbles even the proudest ego. The ocean doesn't need words to stir your soul. The moon remains silent, and yet it softens the world every night. There is wisdom in stillness. There is truth in quiet. Monks understand this. In the Zen tradition, silence is not a void. It's a mirror reflecting your attachments, your fears, your ego. That's why so many spiritual practices begin not with talking, but with sitting, breathing, listening, watching. Silence teaches us to hear the things we've been running from, and perhaps that's the very reason we've learned to drown it out with stimulation, because silence shows us what we actually feel. And for some, that's terrifying. But here's the twist. When you stop running from silence, you stop running from yourself. And that's where the transformation begins. The modern world tells you to speak louder, argue harder, brand yourself bigger. But Zen whispers something else entirely, something most never get to hear. You don't need to raise your voice to be heard. You don't need to prove your worth to have value. You don't need to speak to be understood. Because when you're rooted in truth, silence becomes your loudest statement. Let me share a short story passed down through Zen tradition. A student once approached his master and asked, "What is the essence of enlightenment?" The master said nothing. The student waited, still nothing. Frustrated, he demanded, "Why won't you answer me?" The master looked into his eyes and calmly replied, "Because in silence you've already heard it. It's not the cleverness of words that awakens the soul, it's the clarity of presence. The next time you feel overwhelmed, the next time your mind feels like a crowded train station with thoughts rushing in all directions, don't add more noise, just stop, breathe, close your eyes, let the silence rise. You'll notice something extraordinary. The world doesn't collapse when you stop reacting. In fact, it begins to make sense. And your inner world, it doesn't become smaller, it becomes infinite. Because silence is not emptiness. Silence is space. And space is where peace lives. Maybe that's what true freedom sounds like. Not a roar, but a whisper you can finally hear. We live in a world where success is measured in numbers, bank accounts, property, prestige. From the moment we're born, we're told to chase more. More things, more money, more security. But have you ever met someone who had all of that yet still felt empty inside? There's a silent hunger no material wealth can satisfy, and that hunger is for meaning. What if I told you the richest people aren't the ones with the most, but the ones who need the least? A simple monk in a worn robe sitting quietly beneath a bodhi tree can be wealthier than a billionaire in a penthouse, because he carries nothing but lacks nothing. That's not poverty, that's freedom. Wealth in its deepest form has nothing to do with ownership. It has everything to do with how peacefully you can sit with yourself when there's nothing left to buy, nothing left to prove, and no one left to impress. That's the kind of wealth that never crashes with the market. It's not stored in banks, it's stored in the heart. But society doesn't reward this kind of richness. We're praised for accumulating, not for letting go. We're taught to fill our homes, not empty our minds. And so we keep climbing higher, faster, until we're too tired to ask where we're even going. The Buddha once said, "Contentment is the greatest wealth. Not gold, not success, not status, just contentment. The kind of deep, quiet joy that arises not when you finally have everything, but when you realize you never needed it in the first place." Let's pause here and reflect. When was the last time you felt truly, deeply fulfilled? Not the thrill of a new gadget, not the short-lived high of a promotion, but the kind of peace that wraps around your soul like a warm blanket, whispering, "This is enough. You are enough." If it's been a while, then maybe, just maybe, you've been searching in the wrong place. Imagine this: you close your eyes, you breathe in deeply. There's no noise, no clutter, no deadline, just stillness. Now ask yourself, is anything missing? In that moment, if your heart is full, then you've just touched real wealth. But this kind of richness demands courage, because to find it, we must stop running. We must turn inward and face the parts of ourselves we've tried to drown in distractions and possessions. We must unclench our fists and let go of comparison, of fear, of the illusion that says, "When I get this, then I'll be happy." No, happiness doesn't live at the end of a shopping cart. It lives in presence, in simplicity, in acceptance. And those who master this walk through life with a lightness that money could never buy. You don't need to renounce the world to be rich in spirit, but you do need to remember what matters. There's a kind of richness in kindness, in patience, in waking up without anxiety because your peace isn't held hostage by things outside your control. So the real question is not, how much do you have? But rather, how little does it take for you to smile? True wealth lies in the clarity that says, "I may not have everything, but I have what I need, and that is enough." When the heart is uncluttered, life becomes luminous. Every moment becomes a gift, every connection sacred. And when your soul is rich, when your inner world is full, even a modest life can feel like a treasure chest. Because what's the use of a mansion if your mind is a prison? What's the value of luxury if your heart is aching for peace? What's the point of having more if every more only adds to the emptiness inside? So take a deep breath, look around. What if everything you truly needed was already here? What if your next step wasn't to acquire more, but to release? Because when you stop chasing the world, you finally hear the whisper of your soul, and that is the richest sound of all. As we grow older, the battles we fight are no longer against the world outside, but within ourselves. Our greatest wounds are often invisible. They come in the form of regrets, fears, loneliness, or that quiet whisper that says, "You're not enough anymore." These internal struggles are subtle but dangerous. Left unattended, they eat away at our peace. The Buddha once taught that the greatest enemy is not others, it is the untrained mind. And an untrained mind in old age can become a battlefield of sorrow. At this stage in life, you don't need to conquer mountains. You just need to learn how to protect your heart. 1. Let go of the could-have beens. How often do you sit quietly and think, "If only I had," or "I should have taken that chance"? These thoughts are thorns in your mind. They don't fix the past, they only poison the present. The Buddha taught that clinging to what cannot be changed is like holding a burning coal with the intention of throwing it at someone. You are the one who gets burned. Instead of reliving what didn't happen, honor what did. Every breath you still take is a second chance, not to change the past, but to free yourself from it. 2. Be gentle with your emotions. In youth, we hide pain behind busyness. But after 70, when the noise settles, our emotions surface. This is when vulnerability shows up. You might feel unneeded, unheard, or even invisible. Protect this sacred space inside you. Don't let those emotions become your identity. Just because you feel lonely doesn't mean you are alone. Buddhist mindfulness teaches us to observe without attachment. Watch your feelings like clouds passing the sky, real but not permanent. 3. Stop comparing your journey. You might look at friends or relatives who have more money, better health, or children who visit more often. The mind compares, and comparison at this age becomes cruel. It says, "You've missed out, you've failed." But the Dharma reminds us each karma has its own unfolding. No two lives are the same, and no one's timeline is better. What matters is whether you wake up today with compassion in your heart, not how others live, but how you meet this moment with grace. 4. Protect yourself from emotional vampires. Even in later life, people can drain you. The complainers, the critics, the ones who speak only of illness, misfortune, or gossip. These people feed off your attention but leave you empty. You don't owe anyone your inner peace. It's not cruel to choose peace over drama. It's wisdom. Buddhist monks in the forest know this truth well. Not everyone deserves access to your heart, especially when that heart has weathered so many storms. Choose stillness over noise. Choose people who nourish your spirit, not those who feed your fears. 5. Embrace silence as a source of strength. After 70, silence is no longer a lack of noise, it's a form of protection. It's where you meet yourself, where healing happens. In Buddhism, silence isn't empty, it's full of awareness. Every morning you sit quietly with your tea, every evening you breathe without rushing. It's a chance to return to your true home, the stillness within. You don't need to win arguments, prove your worth, or explain your choices. Silence is enough. Peace is your answer. The truth is, aging doesn't make you weaker. It reveals where your strength truly lies. And your strength is not in the armor you wear, but in the softness you protect. Let go of the self-criticism, release the past, and learn to sit with your struggles like old friends, not enemies. Because even pain has something to teach you if you stop running from it. The Buddha never promised a life without suffering, but he did offer a path to understand it. And in that understanding, you'll find liberation. As we step into the later chapters of our lives, regret can feel like an old companion, quiet, persistent, and always ready to whisper what could have been. We replay old decisions like broken records, the harsh word we wish we hadn't said, the opportunity we let slip away, the person we loved but didn't tell. It's so easy to keep reliving those moments as if, by examining them one more time, we might change their outcome. But we can't. And more importantly, we shouldn't. Buddhism teaches us to dwell in the present, not to build a shrine to the past. Clinging to regret is like clutching a hot coal with the intention of throwing it at someone. You are the one who gets burned. The Buddha himself said, "Do not dwell in the past. Do not dream of the future. Concentrate the mind on the present moment." This is not just poetic advice. It's the only way to free your heart from the prison of memory. Letting go of regret isn't the same as forgetting. It's about seeing the past for what it was, a lesson, not a life sentence. When you were younger, you made decisions with the tools and awareness you had. You did your best with what you knew. Can you be kind enough to accept that? Can you love the person you were even if they stumbled? Imagine this. You're holding a heavy backpack filled with stones. Each stone represents a regret. With every step, the weight bears down on your shoulders. Now ask yourself, do I really need to carry this any further? Who are you helping by reliving that heartbreak, that mischance, that painful goodbye? At 70 or beyond, you deserve peace. You deserve mornings untainted by guilt and nights untroubled by memory. And peace doesn't come by rewriting the past. It comes by releasing it. You can't start the next chapter of your life if you keep rereading the last one. Here's a powerful Buddhist practice. Sit quietly and bring to mind one regret. Breathe in compassion, breathe out release, and say softly to yourself, "I forgive myself. I release this, I choose peace." Do this daily, even just for a minute. You'll feel your emotional burdens lighten like mist evaporating under morning sun. Your soul wasn't meant to carry these shadows. Life is too precious, especially now, to waste a single moment shackled to sorrow. Forgiveness is a gift you give to yourself, not because the past was perfect, but because the present still holds joy. Let go. Not because the past doesn't matter, but because you matter more. There is an old Zen saying, "When you throw mud at someone, you lose ground." This simple truth carries profound weight. After 70, life no longer waits for grudges to be resolved or bitterness to be justified. Every day becomes a sacred opportunity, not to win arguments, not to prove who was right, but to unburden your heart of the heavy stones you've carried for decades. And one of the heaviest is unresolved personal conflict. Whether it's a sibling rivalry that never healed, a marriage scarred by silence, or an old friend you haven't spoken to in years, these personal conflicts don't just linger in memory. They poison the soul. Not necessarily because the conflict still exists in the outside world, but because the mind replays it, again and again, like an unresolved piece of music. From a Buddhist perspective, personal conflicts are like the second arrow. The first arrow is the event itself, the argument, the betrayal, the misunderstanding that may have happened years ago. But the second arrow is the one we shoot ourselves with every time we relive the conflict, every time we replay the story, every time we define ourselves by that wound. Let's be clear. Protecting yourself does not mean ignoring injustice or pretending nothing happened. It means choosing not to be poisoned twice. If someone wronged you, let the past be the teacher, not the jailer. Here's what most people forget. When we talk about someone who hurt us, we are often not trying to communicate. We're trying to spread pain. That pain, even when justified, becomes toxic the moment we pour it into others. In Buddhism, this is known as unskillful speech. Words, when used unconsciously, can become weapons, cutting not just others but wounding ourselves. This is especially dangerous in old age. With time running short, every bitter word spoken becomes a lost chance to bring peace. Every harsh comment is a thread cut from the fabric of connection. As people get older, their circles shrink. Friends pass. Family moves away. If personal conflicts are not resolved, they become ghosts that haunt our quiet moments. And sadly, we may never get the chance to make amends, either because the other person is no longer here or because our time runs out. So what can be done? First, turn inward. Meditation isn't just about breath, it's about clearing the mind of old shadows. Sit with your resentment. Ask yourself, why am I still holding this? Often it's not about the person, it's about what that conflict represents: betrayal, rejection, loss of control, or unmet expectations. Second, choose the path of right intention. Even if you never reconcile with the person involved, you can release the burden. Write a letter and burn it. Whisper forgiveness into the wind. Pray not for reconciliation but for peace. This doesn't make you weak, it makes you free. Third, stop spreading poison through words. Notice how often you bring up the past to others, not to seek healing but to vent anger. And recognize, every time you do, you're not just hurting others, you're re-wounding yourself. The Buddha said, hatred does not cease by hatred but only by love. This is the eternal law. Even if love feels impossible, neutrality is a step closer to peace. Elderly wisdom isn't just about knowing facts or quoting scriptures. It's about embodying what you've learned. The older you get, the more you must become a sanctuary, not a battlefield. Let others feel safe around you. Let your presence feel like a balm, not a blade. Here's a story from the Zen tradition. A monk once asked the master, "How do I deal with people who constantly hurt me?" The master replied, "If someone offers you a gift and you do not accept it, to whom does the gift belong?" The monk answered, "To the giver, of course." "Exactly," said the master. "Then stop accepting what is not yours." You do not have to accept their anger, you do not have to accept their hatred, and you certainly don't have to carry that into your final years. Let their poison stay with them, you are not their vessel. So, after 70, protect your peace like sacred ground. Don't relive the fight. Don't reopen the scar. Don't become the echo of pain that once visited you. Be the silence that absorbs, transforms, and finally ends it. Because in the end, no one looks back from their deathbed and says, "I wish I stayed angry longer." They say, "I wish I found peace sooner." When people think of old age, they often think of endings, retirements, closures, farewells. But if you're over 70 and still breathing, then life is not done with you yet. In fact, now is the most sacred time to revisit something many gave up on too soon: your dreams. There's a Zen saying, "Within the heart of the old oak is the memory of the seed." That seed, your dream, your hope, your vision, it's still alive. And if you're not careful, the world will try to steal it, or worse, convince you that it never mattered. At this stage of life, you don't need to chase grand ambitions or seek the applause of the world. What matters now is not letting the light within you go out. That light, your curiosity, your longing to express something meaningful, is your soul's whisper, and it's sacred. Why you must protect the seed now? When you were younger, you may have postponed your dreams for family, for work, for survival. That's understandable. But now, when the noise has settled and the world asks less of you, you owe it to yourself to honor what still stirs your heart. Too many elderly people allow the seed of their aspirations to rot under the soil of regret, fear, and it's too late thinking. But the truth is, it's only too late when you believe it is. Time is no longer your master. It's your ally if you use it well. You don't need to become famous or build an empire. Your dream can be as simple as writing that book that's been in your mind for years, painting the landscapes you saw in your childhood, volunteering to teach or share your wisdom with the next generation, learning the guitar, the brush, the language you always loved, planting a garden not for profit but for joy, traveling not far but deep even if it's within. These are not silly ideas. These are sacred fulfillments. The world may mock, but don't let it kill. Often, society tells the elderly to sit down, slow down, and act their age. That advice is not kindness, it's control. It's an unconscious way of dismissing the elderly as irrelevant. But your dreams are not a burden. They are a declaration that your soul still breathes. If others mock or question your ambitions at 70, 80, or even 90, smile gently and keep walking. You don't owe anyone an explanation for your joy. You owe it only to yourself and to the life force that still moves through you. Protect it like a flame. Your dreams may be fragile. You may not have the energy of youth, but you have something more powerful: clarity, patience, and wisdom. You've seen what matters and what doesn't. You no longer chase shadows. So now, more than ever, protect that small flame of aspiration from the winds of doubt. Feed it each day. A little time, a little love, a little commitment. You'll be amazed at how fulfilled, alive, and youthful you can feel even at 75 simply by doing something that matters to you. A Buddhist reminder. In Buddhist teachings, the path is not about becoming something but uncovering who you truly are. Your dreams are not a fantasy. They are pointers to your deeper essence, the version of you that existed before society told you who to be. Don't let go of the seed, water it. Don't hide your light, let it shine, even if softly. Don't postpone your joy, embody it. As Zen Master Dojin wrote, "A flower falls even though we love it, and a weed grows even though we do not love it. Time passes and not everything is in your control. But what is this moment, right now. To choose love over apathy, to choose expression over silence." As the sun begins to set in the later years of our lives, one truth becomes clearer than ever. What we give away is what stays with us the longest. And in Buddhism, the concept of dana, the practice of giving, is not merely about offering material things. It's about cultivating a heart that lets go, shares without expectations, and finds joy in the act of generosity itself. But let's be honest. Many people, especially in their older years, either hold on too tightly or give with conditions. Some donate for praise, others help only those they like, and many wait until it's too late, writing charitable gifts into their wills, never having tasted the joy of giving while alive. True dana isn't about charity, it's about liberation. It frees not just the recipient but the giver. When we give without expecting anything in return, no praise, no recognition, no rewards, we dissolve ego, soften pride, and plant seeds of compassion in the world. Let's reflect on the story of King Ashoka, a fierce warrior who transformed into one of the most generous Buddhist kings in history. After witnessing the horrors of war, he turned inward and embraced the Dharma. He built thousands of stupas, supported monks, spread the Buddha's teachings across Asia, and treated all people, even animals, with respect. His transformation didn't come from guilt. It came from the awakening that no amount of conquest could bring the peace he found in a single act of compassion. Many elderly people feel they have nothing left to give, but that's a lie sold by the ego. You don't need money to practice dana. Your smile can be a gift. Your presence can be a gift. A kind word to someone lonely, a hand resting gently on a grandchild's head, your wisdom shared with someone struggling, these are all acts of dana. But here's the trap. Many elderly fall into the pattern of conditional giving. I did all this for them and now they don't visit me, they say. But that's not dana, that's a transaction. True dana expects nothing. And when practiced sincerely, it sets you free from bitterness and disappointment. Moreover, in Buddhism, giving doesn't just benefit the other, it purifies your own mind. Each act of generosity weakens the grip of greed and self-centeredness. Each time you give, you loosen the knots of craving. And in that letting go, you come closer to inner peace. Consider this. The good deeds you do now, however small, echo far beyond your lifetime. A word of encouragement today might save someone from despair. A meal you offer may plant the seed of faith in someone's heart. A book you pass on might awaken another's wisdom long after you're gone. As you age, don't measure your worth by what you have. Measure it by what you give. Protect your good deeds. Don't let cynicism, regret, or disappointment erode the purity of your generosity. Give from the heart without clinging, and you will discover a joy deeper than possession. In the end, your good deeds are the most enduring part of your legacy. Money fades, property is passed on, fame dissolves, but your kindness remains etched into the hearts you've touched, woven into the fabric of life itself. So give, not because you should, but because it frees you. Give not to be remembered, but to become lighter. Give, not because it changes the world, but because it transforms you. Because the truest wealth you'll carry beyond this life is the merit born from compassion. In a world that never stops talking, where everyone seems to have an opinion, a complaint, or a comment, silence often feels like a weakness. We're taught to speak our truth, to never stay silent, and to stand our ground. But the Buddhist path offers a deeper wisdom, a recognition that sometimes holding back is not cowardice but compassion. Not silence from fear, but silence from understanding. Silence, when it comes from a wise heart, is one of the most profound gifts we can offer. It doesn't mean apathy or indifference. Rather, it's the space between reaction and response. It's the moment when ego steps aside and awareness takes its place. There's an old Zen story about a student who came to his master, furious at another monk for insulting him. "I must correct him. I must speak out," he insisted. The master simply smiled and said, "When a dog barks at the moon does not bark back." The student was confused. "But master, I must defend my honor." And the master replied, "If your honor depends on barking, then it was never real honor." Silence is not inaction. It's a higher form of action. When someone insults you and you choose not to retaliate, that's not weakness, that's discipline. When people gossip and you don't add fuel to the fire, that's not being disconnected, that's being responsible. When someone challenges your beliefs and you don't argue but listen deeply instead, that's not submission, it's strength. Buddhism teaches that right speech is not just about speaking the truth. It's about speaking at the right time in the right way with the right intention. But even more powerful than right speech is right silence. The noble silence of a mind that no longer needs to prove anything. Many of us, as we grow older, look back on conversations we wish we never had. Words said in anger that tore a relationship. Opinions forced upon others that only created distance. Warnings unheeded, truth shouted at deaf ears. In hindsight, silence would have been the higher road. The Buddha once said, "Better than 1,000 hollow words is one word that brings peace." But better than even that one word is the silence that brings no harm. Silence is not just absence of noise, it's the presence of awareness. It's in silence that we can truly hear what others are saying, not just their words, but their pain behind the words. It's in silence that we understand our own motives, whether we speak to enlighten or to dominate. It's in silence that wisdom grows, because silence is the womb of understanding. So what does this mean in daily life? It means you don't need to respond to every insult. You don't need to correct every mistake. You don't need to engage in every argument. Let people talk. Let them be right. Let them misunderstand you. Your peace is more valuable than your pride. Let the inner fires cool. Let the waves settle. There is a type of silence that is louder than shouting, deeper than wisdom, and more healing than any apology. That silence says, I see you, I feel you, but I no longer need to react. For those in their later years, this becomes a true sanctuary. You've seen enough. You've said enough. Now there's beauty in the unspoken. Now there's freedom in not always needing to be heard. You begin to realize that not every battle is worth fighting, not every opinion must be shared, and not every pain needs to be passed on. You may not be able to change the noise of the world, but you can become the silence within it. And in doing so, you become a refuge for yourself and for others. Hold back not from fear, but from wisdom. Choose silence, not from passivity, but from power. Because sometimes the most loving thing you can say is nothing at all. There are teachings that shout, and there are teachings that whisper. But the most powerful ones are those that unfold in silence, slowly, quietly, and deeply within the heart. They don't announce themselves with noise, applause, or drama. Instead, they live within the ordinary lives of people you might never notice, people who have found their own quiet transformation. Let me tell you the story of Nguyen, a 76-year-old gardener from a small village in central Vietnam. He never traveled far, never sought fame, never earned much. But what he cultivated wasn't just vegetables, it was presence. Every morning, Nguyen would rise before sunrise, bow 3 times to the bodhi tree in his backyard, and begin his day of tending to the earth. Neighbors often saw him smiling alone, pruning, watering, or simply sitting under a tree listening to the wind. They said, he doesn't talk much, but when he does, the whole village listens. One day, a troubled young man came to him, angry at the world, bitter about how life had treated him unfairly. He expected advice, solutions, or at least some consolation. But Nguyen simply invited him to sit silently beside the lotus pond. For hours, they said nothing. Just the sound of frogs, dragonflies buzzing, and wind dancing over the water. When the young man finally broke the silence and asked, "Why don't you say anything?" Nguyen smiled and said, "You've been listening to your suffering for so long that it drowned out everything else. Today, you heard something older and deeper, life itself." That moment changed the young man's life, not because of profound words, but because of the silent presence of a man who had already transformed himself quietly. Another story comes from Kyoto, Japan. A woman named Aiko who had lived in silence for nearly 2 decades after the death of her only child. She stopped attending festivals, turned away from neighbors, and closed her heart to the world. But what seemed like grief turned over time into something else. During those years, she spent her mornings at a Zen temple, learning to sweep floors, serve tea, and care for stray cats. A student monk once asked her, "How did you survive your sorrow?" She answered, "I didn't. It died while I was sweeping." Each stroke of the broom swept away a little more pain. No one celebrated her. No book was written about her, but her silent presence began to change others. Women with grief came to see her. She didn't speak much. She just offered warm tea, a soft cushion, and her quiet company. Slowly, they too began to heal, not because of therapy, but because someone had transformed her pain into peaceful presence. There are countless such quiet transformations happening around us. The widowed man who spends his evenings reading aloud to the neighborhood children because he used to read to his wife. The elderly woman who lost her eyesight but guides others in meditation, her presence brighter than any candle. The retired teacher who tends to dying patients in hospice, holding their hands as they take their final breaths, not afraid, not talking, just being. Buddhism doesn't promise dramatic miracles. It teaches that the greatest transformation often happens quietly, like a seed under soil, like snow melting into spring, like anger dissolving into a soft breath. As Zen Master Thich Nhat Hanh once said, the best way to take care of the future is to take care of the present moment. And sometimes, the best way to care for others is simply to be someone who has returned to the present moment, whole, kind, silent. You don't need to shout your transformation to the world. Just live it. Because someone somewhere is quietly watching you, hoping it's possible. And when they see you smile without reason, forgive without conditions, and breathe without anger, they'll start to believe that transformation is possible for them too. And that's how wisdom spreads, not like wildfire, but like a candle lit from one to another. In the noisy world of constant connection, instant gratification, and endless striving, it becomes easy to forget that the most sacred space is not somewhere out there in the world, but deep within you. The teachings of Zen Buddhism, perhaps more than any other tradition, direct us gently back to this truth. The ultimate temple is the inner self. The Buddha himself taught that peace is not found by rearranging the external world, but by attending to the mind, refining it, and finally transcending it. Your inner life is a sanctuary that the world cannot touch unless you allow it. But most of us grow up without being taught how to protect or even notice this space. We are taught to achieve, to perform, to serve, to survive, but rarely to be, to breathe, to listen to our own spirit. When we fail to nourish the sacred inner life, we become restless, discontent, and hollow. No amount of external success, approval, or activity can fill the silence that grows louder in the absence of self-awareness. But when we begin to honor that space, something remarkable happens. We begin to feel whole. When we talk about something being sacred, we often imagine temples, rituals, incense, chants. But the inner life is sacred not because it is elaborate. It's sacred because it's true. It's the raw honesty of admitting when you're hurting. It's the quiet joy of watching the rain fall and feeling connected to the earth. It's the deep humility of noticing your own ego and choosing not to act on it. It's the silent forgiveness of someone who will never say sorry. These are not loud acts, but they are holy ones. The sacred inner life is not about becoming someone else, but about becoming more yourself. The version of you that is unconditioned, awake, and present. Buddhism teaches that stillness is not stagnation. It is a living, breathing awareness. It's not laziness, it's alert peace. In the West, we are taught to measure a good life by how much we've done. In Zen, the question is different. Have you truly seen? Have you seen a flower and not just named it? Have you sat with yourself and not tried to fix what you found? Have you dared to rest, not because you're exhausted, but because you value your being? That is the sacredness of the inner life. Stillness allows us to touch the present moment in its fullness. And when we do, we realize that this breath, this awareness, this moment is enough. The deeper you go inward, the more you encounter emptiness. But this isn't a sad, lonely emptiness. It's the Buddhist concept of shunyata, the space where all things arise and pass away. The void that holds infinite potential. Your inner life, when cleared of clutter, becomes like a mirror. It doesn't add anything. It simply reflects what is, with clarity, with kindness. When your mind becomes that mirror, you no longer need to chase peace. It arises naturally from within. To live with reverence for the sacred inner life means you'll sometimes have to make hard choices. You'll need to say no to meaningless noise. Turn off the stream of opinions that drown your intuition. Walk away from shallow conversations and walk into solitude. Reject comparison and re-enter compassion for yourself and others. This doesn't mean you live apart from the world. It means you live from a deeper place within it. Every action, every word, every moment flows from that sacred center. In the end, all teachings, Buddhist or otherwise, lead back to this: know thyself. Tend to the inner garden, keep it sacred. The world will try to sell you happiness. The sacred inner life reminds you you already are it. Don't neglect that which can never be taken from you. Your house may fall, your body may age, your loved ones may depart, but the presence within you, the still, unshakable witness, that remains. This is where your true life is. Not in the stories others tell about you, but in the silent truth you live when no one is watching. Protect that life. It is sacred. And once you truly live from it, every step becomes a prayer.